Hey guys, welcome. My name is Vanya, and in today's webinar, we're going to talk about 3 advanced plays every player needs to implement into their game. Again, that's my first time as a coach for DJ Wizard, so if you have any things I can improve on, any advice for me, please let me know. Okay, let's start with the structure of today's webinar. I'm going to start off by the necessity of advanced plays, right? Why do we want to implement advanced plays into our game? Then we go over to the main chapter of today, the 3 advanced plays, starting by finding unnatural bluffs, considering different sizes, and then last but not least, we go over to donking. Yeah, let's start with the first chapter, the necessity of advanced plays. So, some players might tell you that more complex looking plays are necessary and that you should not become a victim of the fancy play syndrome. They will tell you to instead stick to the strategy you already know and that advanced plays don't work against your player pool. While it's true that we should not attempt specific strategies just to be different, we still always want to aim for the highest DB outcome. This implies a constant level of study and improvement, and as well as the willingness to learn new strategies. For me personally, when I started with poker, I was told to simply range bet every board texture in every scenario because it's easy, right? And most opponents will react way differently than they're supposed to do. I followed this advice for quite a while, and while I was winning, I still felt I missed out on a lot of money. So as soon as I became more interested in the game, leveling up, I just skyrocketed with my win rate. So let's take a look at 3 reasons why we want to level up our game and implement these advanced looking plays. Okay, so the first one is you will start to run people over, right? Most players, especially in the low and mid stakes fields, are not used to advanced strategies. They don't often play against such competent opponents, nor have they studied diligently and effectively enough to implement those plays. This is very similar to other areas in life. As soon as most people face things they're not familiar with, they will make tremendous mistakes because they have simply no idea how to react, right? The second reason is you will be able to compete with strong opponents. Winning money from weaker opponents in your field and losing it right back to the better ones is pretty annoying. So one way to prevent this is to put them into tough spots, making it more tricky to play against you. Because don't forget, minimizing or even erasing losses versus good opponents will also impact your win rate. Not just winning against fish, also winning money or at least being break even against the better players impacts your win rate. And last but not least, it's important that you become more curious and confident, right? Because being curious is one of the most important traits in general. It will help you to not lose joy in poker because you constantly experience new moments, right? So to have an internal seeking to explore the unknown will keep poker fun and interesting for you. Learning and building your strategies you later apply in your game while seeing the first positive result will also give you a massive confidence boost, right? So I would say let's start with the actually main chapter, finding unnatural bluffs, considering different sizings, and donking. We start off by finding unnatural bluffs, right? Define this basically what a natural bluff is. I have a picture for you. So this is a spot, button opens, we threw it in the small blind, the button calls, and we bet flop and turn on this texture. Now on the river, we arrive with so many busted draws, right? We arrive with 7-8, Jack-8, King-Jack, Queen-Jack, so many busted draws that it's pretty easy to find natural bluffs here, right? So the player pool might actually tend to bluff too much here because they kind of lose control over the frequency and bluff too much. As we can see here in this example, we give up so many bluffs, right? But people might just tend to lose control and bluff too much. Here's an example where it's kind of the opposite, where we actually heavily underbluff, or where most people heavily underbluff, right? It's a spot where the button 3-bets the cutoff calls, on the flop the button bets, and now on the turn we arrive on a 4 in hearts, right? So what natural bluffs are possible? None, right? There are basically no gut shots, no straight draws, no flush draws. So we kind of have to be more creative in finding bluffs. So we have to pick these 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s with a heart. So that's pretty tough to find. So most players actually heavily underbluff in this spot because you have to be kind of studied to actually know your range and understand that you have to use these pairs as a bluff. So in general, this is a definition that you know what I mean by natural and unnatural bluffs. So let's go right into the first example, I'm gonna show you 2 examples for the chapter Finding Unnatural Bluffs. The first one is bluffing turned pairs. So this is a spot, the button opens, big blind defends, flop, the button bets for small sizing, big blind calls, and now we're on the turn. Big blind checks, the button heavily polarizes here, right? Because he doesn't really want to bet hands like queen anymore and just wants to use his advantage here to leverage and build a pot, right, with the strongest hands. So, as we can see, the most natural bluffs are pretty easy to find. These jack 10s, jack 9s, 10 9s, these gut shots here, and some ace size to outdraw villain's top pair. But there are some hands that are actually pretty unnatural to find, meaning these turn pairs here, right? For example, ace 4, jack 4, and 5-4, right? These are pretty unnatural to find. So, as a question to you guys, why do you think do we want to bluff these turn pairs in this spot? The first reason, as you guys said, is that we block turned 2 pairs, right? It's pretty interesting actually, that if we take a look at the big blind on the flop and go over here to the best hands between 80 and 100% equity, we see that villain is actually almost pure raising all of his strong hands on the flop. His 7s, king, queen, king 7, and queen 7, right? This means that villain arrives with basically no nuts on the turn. None, right? So basically the only strong hands he has left are turn 2 pairs. And if we actually have a 4, we block so much of villain's turn under range, right? So this is one reason, as you guys said. Very good. Another reason is that we actually fold out a lot of better hands. If we see, we go for very large sizing here. We see that we are folding out all third pairs. We're folding out a lot of second pairs. And we also deny a lot of equity. For example, a hand like jack 10 has 14 outs against our 4. 14 outs. And we fold this also a lot. We're folding out ace 10, which has 10 outs. We're folding out these hands, which have 6 outs, right? We're folding out so many hands that are better or in general just deny a lot of equity, which is very, very good. That's basically the second reason. The third reason is that we can outdraw villain's top pair hands, right? Because as we said, most of villain's strong hands, top pairs he has left, and we actually have 5 outs with our pairs, right? We have 2 4s and 3 jacks, and we actually have a pretty hidden hand, right? Let's say we make a 4. Most people will never suspect that we have a 4, and we often get paid. And we definitely get more paid compared to a hand like 10-9. If we turn a jack, it's way more obvious for people, right? But if we turn a 4, people will often just definitely pay us more. These are the 3 reasons. Let's summarize this over in the slides. As we said, the first reason was that we block a large amount of villain's top range, right? Because villain is basically raising all of his flopped strong hands, so the only strong hands he has left are turned 2 pairs, and by blocking that, we block so much of villain's range. Second reason is, as we said, that we're folding out a lot of better hands, right? All these third pairs and second pairs and deny a lot of equity. We have 5 outs to outdraw villain's top pairs. Just as an heads up for you guys that it's not getting confusing, let's take a look back. Let's say the flop is a little bit different. Let's say the flop is something like this. King 4-8, right? We are still betting a lot of hands on the flop. The flop is pretty good for us. So we're betting a lot of our hands on the flop for a small sizing. And now let's say the turn is a jack, right? So in this case, we definitely block turn 2 pairs, right? We block jack 4, jack 8, and king jack. But in this case, we see that we don't bluff any jack x. This is simply because our jack is way too strong. It doesn't really make sense to bluff any jack x in this spot, right? Because the jack still beats our 4x and 8x and just in general denies less equity, right? As you guys can see, we go here to filter, we go to equity. See that our jack, for example, and like jack 10 still has over basically 70% equity, right? So these hands are way too strong. So as a general heuristic, we want to say that we block turn 2 pairs in these single raise pots a lot if the turned pair is below the third pair, right? Because then we fold out a lot of better hands and are kind of, not just making a big polarization error, right? So we definitely fold out a lot of better hands. So as a tip, in general, if the turn pairs below the third pair and it's a turn brick, so villain still doesn't have much strong hands, we often want to use these turn pairs as a bluff and also follow through on the river because they block so much of villain's value range. Yeah, that's for the first example. Now we go to a little bit more complex spot, but don't worry guys, we'll figure this out. Now I want to show you a spot where we actually bluff trips. So let's take a look here. So the spot is like this. We're on the big blind, UTG opens, we call, UTG bets flop, big blind calls, the turn goes check, check. Now on the river, we arrive with a lot of ace-x, right? So we build our range mainly around ace-x for a medium sizing, we bet, and now villain is going to raise, right? This raising range mainly comes from his flushes on the turn and from his turned trap boats and some ace-4 righty rivers. So he's raising mainly his bluffs, right? These broad raise with a diamond, and then he's going to raise these flushes, right? And he's raising his boats and better, right? So this is basically his value range. So let's take a look how we want to respond. It's always important in these spots, if you want to find bluffs in general, ask yourself how your range and the range of your opponents look like, right? So our range basically looks like this. We have hands that are complete air, right? Our missed gut shots, these hands, right? They miss completely. Then we have our flushes, and then we have basically our boats that want to get the money in always, and then we have our trips left. So we basically have 4 hand classes here. So against the race, after us betting, our flushes are often strong enough to call, except our low ones, right? But these flushes, the best ones we have, still even beat value, so they are value catchers, so they're never folding. And our lowest ones are kind of indifferent, right? They're bluff catchers, so they're different between calling and folding. Then we have our boats. They're obviously good enough to get the money in, right? And then we have our complete air. This is just folding, right? Because we have pretty bad blockers. We don't block any of villain's top range, so we can't really rebluff these hands. And if we take a look, for example, take a look at villain's folding range, we see that villain is folding most of his flushes, right? He's folding over 2/3 of his flushes, meaning that we don't really want to have a diamond either, because then we just mainly block his folding range, right? So these hands are just complete trash. They will always fold. Then we end up as our only bluffs basically with our trips. So the spot might seem pretty complicated at first, but if you think about your range, about your opponent's range and what we target, we see that our trips are actually at the bottom of our range and actually have pretty decent blockers, right? They block villain's boats and unblock all folding range. So let's say we have a hand like ace-3, no diamond, or here ace-8, no diamond. We see that ace-8, no diamond will raise, and ace-8 with a diamond is basically never raising because it simply blocks too much folds, right? With the 8 and diamonds. So if we have a hand like an ace with no diamond, we block all of his villain's boats and we block absolutely no folds. So these hands actually made pretty good bluffs, which is pretty cool, right? So let's summarize this. So we actually are at the bottom of our value range with our trips, and in spots when our natural bluffs, like our missed gut shots and straight draws and missed flush draws, have pretty bad blockers to villain's top range, we actually don't want to bluff them. Then we basically have only left the bottom of our value range, which is, in this case, our trips. So in general, in these spots, we want to pick our bottom of our value range, which have actually pretty excellent blocker properties. So to kind of illustrate you this even more, I want to show you a hand, because this here on the right, as you guys can see, this is basically what you want to have into your arsenal. These 3 questions here. You always want to ask yourself, how does my range and my opponent's range look like? What do we want to represent and what do we target? And especially in low stakes games, how will my opponent react realistically? So to help you not just blindly follow through with your bluffs, I want to show you a hand I played myself. I think this is pretty cool to give you guys something practical also for myself. So in this case, me and my opponent, 800 big blinds deep, but this is a spot where we had the double straddle on, so it's actually only 200 big blinds. Everybody folds, the button limps, we raise, and in this case, this is a slight error by me. He should have 800 big blinds. So this player that you guys know has the same stack as me, right? So we are both 800 bigs deep. He calls, and button calls too. In this case, we often want to check multi-way with our lowest pairs. They don't really need any protection, right? I want to keep the pot small multi-way. So we check, villain bets, and we're never folding this yet. On the turn, this is a little X goes to donking. We improve way more, right? Because in these multi-way spots, villain doesn't really bet any queen X, but we defend queen X, so we arrive naturally with more trips, so we're allowed to donk. I like to donk a little bit more in practice because people are just too passive in general, especially when they perceive us strong. So that's at least my perspective. We don't get raised here nearly enough. So I like to donk this. And on the river, this hand is not good enough to bluff, not good enough to value bet, and kind of too strong to bluff. We still beat hands like King, Jack, Jack 10, and shock with all the ace-X. So I check this. Now villain bets roughly half pot. So in this case, I'm pretty sure that he mainly always has a flush, right? Just by the sizing he chooses, especially in live games, people tell you their hand strength by their size because they don't really think, okay, I have like maybe 2 sizings here. They simply just think about their hand in a vacuum. So in my opinion, this is just mainly a flush. Only in this spot, which is heavily underbluffed, right? Because what bluffs can have in this spot? There are no natural bluffs to find. And against people that are more weak and passive, but still are able to think, right, about my range, I always really like to bluff kind of more than I'm supposed to do. So this hand is okay to use. Better would be something like ace 4, that we still block pocket 4s, and queen 4, or like a single queen would also be pretty nice to block hands like ace queen more often. But yeah, I think in this spot, we always get villain to fold a flush, especially if we play against someone that's on a station, they can think about our range, but it's not good enough to think more detailedly about the spot, and basically doesn't come up with any bluffs. So I jammed this. We are still very deep, right? This is a mistake here. He has the same amount as me, and he actually showed me ace 5 in spades and folded. So I just want to show you this hand, guys, because especially if you play in low stakes, mid stakes games, people often tell you their hand strength with their sizing, and especially if you play against weaker regs or people that are more passive in general, you will get to fold a lot in these spots, right? Because people might say, it doesn't work in my games, people don't fold. That's not true. There are a lot of spots in low mid stakes games where people heavily overfold, and especially in these spots where they perceive you as very strong and are not very strong themselves, right? Because I'm pretty sure he doesn't really have any ace queen, and also how he played the hand doesn't have any boats. So there are certain spots, especially in low mid stakes games, where people heavily overfold. So I want you to attack them, and you can fight these by, as I said, ask yourself these 3 questions here. I told you, right? But if you do that, you will kind of have a pretty or more easy life to maneuver through these spots. So this is considering different sizes. So I prepared for you guys 2 different ones. The first one is 10% sizing. Most of you guys know the 10% sizing from 4-bet pots, right? In spots where, especially on ace-high boards, where the texture is very dry and the SPR is very low, so we don't need large sizes to get the money in. So we generally use these very small sizes, but here I want to show you a spot on the river where these 10% sizings definitely make a lot of sense. So a question to you guys, what do you think? Why do we want to use these 10% sizings in these spots? The spot is that hijack opens, we threw it in the small blind, hijack calls. On the flop, we go with the half pot sizing, hijack calls, turn we bet again for half pot, hijack calls. Now on the river, we arrive on the nut changing 4 in clubs. The first reason is kind of, in general, when we want to use these 10% sizings, as river needs to be nut, the equity heavily shifts. For example, on a total brick, like a 2 in spades, for example, we see that our overpairs, aces and kings, have 80% equity and are strong enough to jam. But in this case, we don't have any small sizes because our strong hands on the turn are strong enough to jam, right? And we don't really have any hands that want to go for small sizing because we're pretty polarized anyways. So on bricks, doesn't really make much sense to have small sizes here. They have 80% equity and can use the all-in sizing. But on the nut changing 4, we actually see that our top range gets massively decreased in equity, right? We see that all of a sudden they only have 50% equity roughly. So on these nut changing rivers, we kind of need to have a small betting range because our turned top range is still strong enough to bet, but can't really use large sizing. And in these spots where we want to use 10%, the EV between betting and checking is actually very close, as we can see here. Let's go to equity and go over to the EV graph, and we can see that the EV for betting and checking is basically the same, right? So on these spots, actually, we want to use very small sizing between betting and checking because these hands are not strong enough to use the standard 1/3 block sizing. So the first main reason is that we kind of realize equity very cheaply, right? Because when we block for 10%, we kind of prevent villain from reopening the action for large sizing. And as we can see, if we check, villain is only reopening the action for all-in. So kind of prevent this by using the 10% sizing that we don't need to face larger sizes. So kind of for the sake of equity release. The second reason is that we want villain not to basically check back his worse hands, right? Because if we check, villain's going to check back all his worst hands, all ace jacks, king jacks, all queen jacks. His pocket queens are checking back mainly, and some of his 10s and 9s are checking back. So these hands that would always call 10% sizing will always check back. So as we can see, these hands mostly call 10%, not always, but yeah. If we can click on top pairs here, for example, let's go on top pairs and over pairs. We see that they're calling almost 80% of the time. So we're kind of missing out on value if we don't use these 10% sizings. It's definitely important that we get called enough by worse, right? So if these hands are not strong enough, we kind of want to check them and don't build a size around them. So for example, on a 9 in clubs, that's actually way worse for our over pairs because now 10s make a straight. We see that these hands are simply not good enough to bet anymore. We don't build a range around them anymore, and we just have mainly one large sizing for our 10x on flushes. And yeah, don't want to get in the money here with these hands. So definitely think about villain's range. If he has too many strong hands and hands that want to use 10% sizing, heavily decreased in value, and we don't want to use this. So in general, as an heuristic, you can see this here too. I'm going to show you this, the summary of this slide. We want to generally have between 50 and 60% equity, right? And if our hand has below that, we generally don't use any 10% for these hands and just go for the bigger size with our very strong hands. So this about the 10% sizing. Now we go over to the other extreme, which is implementing huge overbets. So the first big reason for implementing huge overbets is that we want to have a huge nut advantage. And I'm going to show you 3 hands actually here, because we have 3 scenarios where we want to use huge overbets. And the first one is leveraging a huge nut advantage in spots where villain has enough worse hands to call down. So let's go over to the spot. It's as followed. We're very deep, 300 big blinds deep. We open on the cutoff, big blind calls, flop goes, we bet small on the cutoff, big blind calls, and on the turn we use very, very large sizing. This is very, very geometric, meaning we use the same size on turn and river to get the money in. Because if you can see, we use the sizing almost for spot. On the river, we see that we have exactly the same size left. So in spots where we have a massive advantage in nuts, we see that we often want to use these more geometric sizes. And the reason is simply, as said, because we have such an advantage, right? We have huge advantage in nut dance because villain doesn't have any ace king, any kings, he doesn't have any aces, he doesn't have 9s, and he would have a check raised hands like his top hands on the flop already, so he doesn't really have any strong hands left. So we generally I want to use a large sizing in these spots. Let's take a look at a different turn. For example, a 5, we're going to see that we are actually not using any large sizes anymore because we simply don't have more nuts anymore, right? As you guys can see here in the top range, we see that we actually have no strong advantage anymore. So we can't really leverage our advantage because villain makes hands like 3-4. He turns 2 pairs. He didn't have on ace king because he doesn't turn ace king, but in this case he actually turns ace 5. So on the turn where he doesn't make maybe like a lot of strong hands, we generally don't use large sizing. So the first spot is that we need a huge advantage in nuts to be able to use these very large sizings. That's the first spot. This spot is very familiar and very common. Most people are familiar with this. Let's go to the next one, which is a spot where we need to recapture the V of the previous streets, right? And this is this spot. It's as followed. Opens on the button the small blind 3 bets and button calls. And now we are pretty deep again, trying big blinds deep, right? At these spots, we see that we actually use a lot of small sizings. Might be a bit counterintuitive because, yeah, we have so many hands that want kind of protection, right? Hands like a 10, jacks, queens, kings. But we are so deep that we can't really go broke with our strong hands anymore. Like our main strong hands are aces, kings, queens, jacks, and 10x. But they can't really go broke and don't really want to go broke in most rivers because most rivers and turns will heavily be nut changing. But there are so many turns and rivers that can change the nuts. So in these spots, very, very deep and out of position in spots where we have a lot of nut changing cards, we definitely want to use more small sizings because I want to wait for a safe river because the deeper you are, the more strong hands you need on the river. So you don't really want to arrive on the river with a weak range. So we use a small sizing, be definitely more careful because there's so many nut changing cards. Flop small, turn half pot, and on the river, we see actually the opposite, that we have now a lot of very large sizings, right? And the reason is simple. We need to recapture the money we didn't make on the previous streets, and now the river is safe. There's no more card to come, and villain's pretty capped because he didn't raise on streets, because as we see, we are pretty deep. So villain is raising most 8s and 3s, and 10-8, basically all of his very strong hands except some 10s as trap, but he's raising most of his strong hands on the turn in position because we are so deep and he wants to get the money and also kind of wants to get the money before the nut changing card, but he didn't. So our aces and kings and queens are strong enough to get the money. So the second spot is where we want to use very large sizings is in spots where we want to recapture the money we didn't gain on previous streets. So basically, for example, when the flop went check, check, we want to use these very large sizings too in spots where we still have an advantage in strong hands, right? And our aces, kings, queens, and jacks are so massively ahead of villain's range, right? They have so much equity. This is insane, actually. They have 95% equity, which is immense. So they definitely want to get in the money here and recapture the money they didn't gain on previous streets. This is the second example. I want to show you one more. This is more kind of an exploit in live games, also in online games, but mainly in live games. This is happening a lot from what I see. This spot is that it's a 3-bet pot, small blind against button. On the flop, small blind bets, turn, he bets again, and on the river, we mainly have small sizings on the nut changing card. We also put our strong hands into the small size, right? And now we see that villain is actually supposed to raise basically all of his flushes, right? You can see this here, flush, straight, set, 2 pair. Villain is supposed to raise with his sets. A lot of the time, he's supposed to raise with even some 2 pairs, and he's supposed to raise all flushes, even the worst ones. And let's take a look. We bet flop, turn, river, and he's still supposed to raise with his sets very purely and with all of his flushes. And my experience, at least, people are too passive and not finding these. So what happens if we take a look and note log this? If villain is too passive and is not raising enough with his strong hands in position, we actually skip the small sizing with all of our strong hands, right? As I saw in the example before, we saw we are supposed to bet most of his flushes for the small size too, right? But if we go back to the note locked sim, we now see that we are supposed to put all of our strong hands into our big sizing, simply because it would be a disaster if we bet small and villain simply only calls with a hand like pocket nines. So in spots, especially in live games where people are very passive in general, don't put nuts into your small betting range in case you think that they're not raising thinly enough. This is very important because we just massively lose out on money if people are not raising enough. We bet small and they only call hands like pocket nines here. That would be a disaster. So very important to understand this. Okay, so let's go over to the last topic of today's webinar, which is donking. I prepared 3 spots for you on flop turn river that we get to see all of the different streets, right? The first one is a flop, and in general, you want to donk. I think this is pretty common knowledge when we have an equity advantage or a nut advantage on the flop, right? And I'm going to show you a spot, which is this one. So this is a spot where cutoff opens, button 3 bets, and now the cutoff calls again. And on this flop, you can see that the cutoff actually has a huge advantage among the whole range, right? He has an equity advantage. We can see this over here. And we also have an advantage as the cutoff in the strong hands. He has an advantage among the whole range. The red line is the cutoff, and we see that he has an advantage among basically all of the range here. So in these spots where we have such an advantage, we definitely want to donk a lot. And the reason is pretty simple, because for mainly 2 reasons. The one reason is we want to realize equity, right? Because in spots where we are supposed to donk a lot, villain needs to be pretty careful. So what happens when we check here, villain is supposed to check back a lot of his hands. So we kind of give villain the chance to overrealize his equity. So that's why it's pretty important that we just donk here and kind of take the action into our own hand, because villain is simply not aggressive enough. He's allowed to be very passive here because the board is so good for us, right? Because what will happen when we don't donk, villain's actually allowed to check back his entire range. So we kind of let villain realize equity, and we miss out on a lot of money and kind of can't put in the money ourselves in these spots, what we definitely want to do. So in general, on the flop, we donk if we have an equity advantage or not advantage. In this case, it's actually both. That's why we get to donk a lot. And it's not really important on the flop, because on the flop, our ranges are still very wide, not very filtered and condensed. So I think the only spot where I definitely would donk on the flop are these spots, right? These 3 red pots where we have such an advantage that we definitely want to use a sizing here that villain is not allowed to realize equity. Okay, so this is for the flop, right? Let's take a look at the turn. On the turn, it's for the same reason, basically. We get to donk on the turn in spots where the card just improves our range more. This is a spot where we open on the button, big blind calls, and on the flop, the button bets a very large sizing, so he polarizes a lot, we call, and on the turn we get to donk a lot. Actually a lot, right? Almost 84%. Because after polarizing the flop, villain doesn't have much 6x left, so we actually have huge advantage in trips. You can see this here, right? We almost have 4x the amount of villain, so we don't want to let that slide, let villain realize equity. So we definitely want to take the action into our own hand and donk on these spots. So just as a general tip, in spots where villain is polarizing the flop, usually filters his range more, right? He is not betting a 6 much. So in general, in these spots, his range is built around a certain range part, yeah? His air basically, and then his best hand. So, and then on certain turns, the big blind improves just simply so much because the button is not building his range around 6x, right? Let's take a look at when he bets smaller sizing. His range is wider now, and we also have to defend with a wider range. We see that we actually donk way less, right? Because villain is betting more 6x for the small sizing, and we also get to call more often, so our range is wider, so our range is not so much condensed in one pass anymore. So in general, the turn is not as good as after villain heavily uses big size on the flop. So in general, this is pretty good advice on the turn. In general, if villain is using a large sizing on the flop and heavily polarizes the flop, we generally want to use more donks on the turn, right? Because he builds his range around a certain range part, and if the turn improves us, it just heavily improves us way more because his range is more condensed around a certain range part. This is about the turn. And now let's take a look at the last street at the river, which is in this case also a 10-eye board. So we open on the hijack, big blind calls, hijack bets large on the flop, big blind calls, hijack is on the turn and polarizes, big blind calls. Now on the river, we can see that we get to donk a decent amount. And the reason is pretty simple. We simply arrive with, this is pretty insane, half of our range is actually trips. But this is insane. So the thing is that after calling flop and turn, we don't have these complete hands that have no equity, right? Or basically very low equity hands like King Jack, for example. But villain still has these hands in his range. So our range is 10x a lot because these are the most frequent hands we call down, right? And we also have more 10x in our range than villain because we defend the big blind against the hijack. So in general, we just arrive with way more trips on the river, and we also arrive with such a big advantage here in equity that we just generally want to donk more. I want to use a small sizing because we don't just want to bet hands like pocket sevens, we also want to bet weak 10x to kind of prevent villain from checking back all of his overpairs, because when we check here in this case, villain is going to check back all of his overpairs. This is pretty suck, right, for our 10x. And we can actually filter this and see how much overpairs he has. Go to filter. You see that villain actually has almost 1/4 of his range is overpairs. So if we check, we actually lose so much money by not getting corporates, because when we block for small sizing, we see that hijack is always calling, basically most of the time at least, with these hands, right? So we just kind of prevent villain from checking back reverse hands, and we kind of take the action into our own hand because this river improves us so much more than villain. So let's take a look at the summary. We started off by the necessity of advanced plays, right? Implementing advanced plays will help you to build up more confidence, compete with strong opponents, and put players into lines they're unfamiliar with. Right? Especially if you play against weaker opponents, which is most of them in low stakes games. People are not really familiar with these advanced plays and they have no idea how to react, so you will just run them over. That's also the second point. We learned how to implement unnatural bluffs, and that will just help us to run people over. Because especially if you play against more weak and passive opponents, people will often have no idea that you actually have to turn certain hands into bluffs, and then kind of don't find any bluffs in your range, and you get usually people to heavily fold too much in these spots, right? Second was expanding your sizing arsenal. Will help you to reach the highest TV lines. It's pretty similar to with languages. If you speak one language, that's good. But if you speak multiple languages, yeah, you kind of can communicate better. So it's the same as sizings. If you have more sizings in your arsenal, it will help you to maneuver better through spots, right? Because you can simply pick out the sizings that fit the scenario. And last but not least, we had donking. Including donk bets into your game will make you tougher to play against and prevent villain from over-realizing equity. Okay, that's for the summary, guys. If you have any questions, you can always ask us in the Discord server. We have over 50k members there, so if you have any questions, let us know there. And you can also DM me if you want to, if you have any very, very urgent questions. So yeah, thanks for attending, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, could learn something, and see you soon.